The deflecting hard tier is in my opinion the best addition in the entire DLC, and it also is the best crystal tier too. Now how it works is for 5 minutes you gain the ability to perfectly block. So when you block an attack at roughly the same time you're about to get hit, you basically take no physical damage, a lot less elemental damage, and hardly any stamina. But best of all yet, it can actually enhance the damage of your guard counters by up to 80% and the stance damage by roughly 40%, and it will be based on the number of deflects you actually get before landing an attack. So not only does it make for one of the most fun playstyles, but it also makes for a very powerful one at that as well. Guard countering builds were already good before the DLC, but they kind of were centered around only using a shield. But now with this deflecting tier and things like the two-handed sword talisman, you can use it with any single type of weapon and just have it two-handed and make a really powerful build that way. So for today, we're going to go over 10 separate weapons to what I consider the best ones for this deflecting and guard countering type of build. Some of these are only going to be good if you have the deflecting tier. Some of these are going to be good without the deflecting tier as well. Now, I did want to have some variety on the list. I didn't want to have like 10 different colossal weapons because colossal weapons are really quick guard counters and are pretty good at blocking too. But every single one of these weapons is going to be of a different weapon class. I'm not going to include multiple of the same weapon type. To start off with, at number 10, the Greatsword of Solitude. Now, Greatswords are pretty decent at guard counters. They get some nice damage. They get some pretty decent range. Their speeds are actually on the quicker side as well, to the point where they're quicker than things like halberds and even curved Greatswords. They even get some pretty decent stance damage too. But the reason I'm going to pick the Greatsword of Solitude in particular is because it's extremely good at blocking. Does get 58 guard boost and 89% physical guarded damage negation, which is actually the highest out of all the non-colossal swords, weapons, or shields in the entire game. I was picking between this one and the Beastman's Cleaver because they're both somewhat similar in terms of how well they can block, but I did lean more towards the Greatsword, as the weapon does have more range, more stance damage, and it is a bit better at blocking. Now, when you do have the deflect tier, it's not going to make that much of a difference compared to if you had like a normal Greatsword. But if you end up missing a deflect, it is going to be very noticeable, and having the Greatsword of Solitude and just two-handing it and blocking or deflecting, it is going to be pretty powerful. And I think the weapon skill that it has in Solitary Moonslash does pair very nicely with this guard countering type of build, because it does give you the option of having a pretty cheap projectile attack, and the follow-up is actually a nice lunge, and you're going to be like basically attacking into danger, and the whole combo does consume a lot of stamina. But after you lunge into an enemy, and if they're about to attack, you can go ahead and just deflect and not take much stamina at all and just not take any damage. Great Axes, in terms of guard countering builds, are going to be somewhat outclassed by things like Great Hammers because they get the exact same speeds, same hyper armor values, but the Great Hammers are just going to get a bunch more stance damage, because the Great Hammers actually get like the second highest amount of stance damage in the game, whereas things like the Great Axes get just as much stance damage as a Great Sword. But I consider the Rusted Anchor to be a very special exception, purely because it actually gets piercing damage. I always glaze piercing damage like every single video, because a lot of enemies are weaker to this damage type, and when enemies are in the middle of an attack combo, they're going to take bonus damage to this damage type as well, which guard counters in most cases are actually going to be hitting enemies in the middle of an attack combo. So piercing type of weapons are just going to be really good for this build, and the Rusted Anchor is probably going to be one of the hardest hitting types of piercing weapons in the game. So you can just pair this build alongside things like the Spear Talisman, just keep deflecting and guard countering, and you can just output so much damage. And even outside of this guard countering, it's still an amazing weapon. And Great Axes also just get a plethora of really good skills as well. So making a deflecting type of build with the Rusted Anchor is very viable. The Light's Greatswords are an amazing addition to this DLC, and it's mainly because of their really cool movesets. The combo potential that these weapons do have are honestly just peak. Those running, jumping, and regular heavy attacks into the light attack combo is just flawless, because it basically makes it have no recovery animations, and it's just like a fluid movement. And this is also true for the guard counter. It is a very quick double swiping attack that does do just as much stance damage as Greatswords, and it does give you the option of doing an instant light attack directly afterwards. So in that small opening, you can do really good damage and just as much stance damage as things like Great Hammers if you do that nice 3-hit combo. And the fact that it's hitting multiple times in quick succession obviously means the multi-hit talismans are going to be an amazing pairing too. The light Greatswords, and specifically the Milady, can be built around so many different ways, and I think the guard countering builds are going to be one of the better ones to do it. Now, yes, this guard counter is going to be a slightly bit longer animation than some of the other ones, because it does result in a 2-hit swing. So I don't think it's going to be the best overall in terms of guard counters, but as I did mention, it has really quick recovery frames to which you can cancel with a light attack or just roll out of it. So not only does it make for one of the most fun types of guard counter builds, but it is one of the best too. Colossal Swords can make for very good guard countering builds, as they typically do have very good blocking potential. Their guard boost and their guarded damage negation can actually be on the higher end, to the point where they're better than things like colossal weapons and even a bunch of shields in the game. Now, the Greatsword is going to be the best amongst them in terms of its blocking potential, and it conveniently does have some of the most range and the most damage too. So I think it's going to be one of the best options for a guard counter build. Now, the major downside of Colossal Swords is that their speeds are not the best, nor are their stance damage. Things like great hammers and even regular hammers can do more stance damage, and they're going to be quicker too. But there are going to be two different benefits that these Colossal Swords do have. And that's one, it does do a nice horizontal swipe. So if you did want to hit multiple enemies at once, this one is going to be one of the better ones at doing it. And with the range of the Guts' Greatsword, it obviously makes it very easy to land. But I think the best part of Colossal Sword guard counters is how quick the Hype Armor can actually kick in. Out of all the weapons, the Colossal Swords do get the best Hype Armor when it does come to these guard counters. As soon as you start the animation, you can tank a lot of attacks very easily. So yeah, the Guts' Greatsword was already one of the best weapons in the entire game. But with this DLC in the deflecting hard tier and the two-handed sword talisman, it's just gotten even better. The hammers have always made for some of the best guard countering weapons in the entire game, even before the DLC. And that is because not only do they have some of the fastest guard counters, like these things can be faster than straight sword guard counters, but they also do get some of the highest stance damage. They can get 40 stance damage with their guard counters, which is higher than things like a Colossal Sword, and it's going to do it basically instantly. Now, if you're looking to make a guard counter build, but you haven't accessed the DLC yet, you're going to be pretty limited as to what you can use. Because with how much damage that you take when blocking with a weapon, you probably want to be able to use a shield with guard countering, and there aren't many weapons that perform really well with a one-handed guard counter, but I think hammers are definitely one of them. So if you wanted a really good option before you actually got to the DLC, I'd recommend going with the Stone Club, because not only is it like the highest damaging hammer in the game, but it also can be infused, so pairing it alongside Cragblade to just further enhance the damage and enhance the stance damage is just going to make it even better. But upon getting to the DLC and acquiring the deflecting hard tier, you can go ahead and two-hand it, and it actually does get the best blocking out of all the hammers too. It honestly doesn't really matter what type of hammer that you do go with, as all of them can perform equally as well, but I think the Stone Club is the best amongst them. The hand-to-hand arts make for some of the most fun weapons in the game with their really cool and flashy types of movesets, and when going into a deflecting guard counter build, they just make them feel so badass. Now, obviously, these weapons are not going to be good at blocking at all, so even with a deflecting tier, you're still going to be taking a lot of stamina, so it's not going to be the easiest weapons to use. But the DANE'S footwork does actually make for one of the best guard countering weapons. Now, unfortunately, I cannot say the same thing for the Dryleaf arts. Now, both of these do have the exact same animation. They're some of the quickest guard counters in the game, and they actually do it in a nice little AoE, so actually can hit at a further distance than you might expect. But for some reason, the DANE'S footwork just hits multiple times, especially if you are really close up to the enemy, and it can just result in much more damage and more stance damage. The Dryleaf arts guard counters can get 27 stance damage, but the DANE'S footwork can get between 30 and even 40 stance damage, depending on how close you are to the enemy, and it can get anywhere between 50 to 80% more damage too. It is somewhat inconsistent as to how much boosted damage that you do get with these things, but the closer you are, the better. But when you go ahead and slap on things like the deflecting hard tier, you can get upwards of like 50 stance damage and do so much damage to the point where it feels like you're using a colossal weapon, and you're basically doing it in an instant as well. The animation is so fast. Now, it is going to make for a very risky build, because if you do miss a deflect, you're going to take so much damage, because trying to block with this thing is not good at all. So that's the main reason why I'm not going to put it higher on the list. Now, another unfortunate thing about these weapons is that they cannot be buffed with things like Cragblade, and it is going to be a power stance type of weapon, so you're not going to benefit off the two-handed sword talisman as well, but you could use things like the multi-hit talisman to try and make up for it. But if you're really good at the game and you can get a perfect block almost every single time, the DANE'S footwork might just be the best weapon for you. Great hammers are always going to make for amazing options for guard countering builds, as do they not only have amazing blocking potential, but they're also on the quicker end, and they do have some of the highest stance damage. In fact, all these great hammers can get more stance damage than some of the colossal weapons in the game. Now, I think the best great hammer for guard countering is going to go to the Black Steel Great Hammer, but it's not by much, and it is a little bit of a caveat as well, because the Black Steel Great Hammer does actually get a unique guard counter, to where it does this holy AoE aftershock effect upon landing the attack, and this can make it the highest damaging guard counter for the great hammers, and it can be the highest stance damage too. In fact, it actually does have the second highest stance damage in the entire game when it does come to guard countering attacks. Now, unfortunately, you do have to actually hit with the AoE as well to benefit off it, because if you go up against really quick enemies that like to move around, and if the AoE shockwave does miss, then you're actually doing less damage and less stance damage than all the other great hammers, because the weapon directly only does 40 stance damage, where all the other great hammers do 43, but the AoE shockwave does do an additional 6, and that makes it really good. And there are plenty of instances to where I notice that it does just miss with that holy AoE attack, and it can be pretty inconsistent. But in most cases, you are just going to land with the attack, and it's just going to result in really good damage. Against smaller enemies, it can just stun lock them too, at which you can just get a free follow-up light attack as well, and it can just make for a very deadly combo. And obviously, it is really fun and flashy looking. So if you haven't given the Black Steel Great Hammer a try with a deflecting build, I recommend that you do. The Sword Lance is one of the best weapons to come out of the DLC and probably one of the best weapons in the game period, as this thing just hits like a fucking truck. Like there is no other way to say it. It just hits that hard. It has the most like insane strength scaling to where you just get so much damage to the point where it out damages every single great spear, and it can even out damage great axes in this game. And you're just going to get the heavy thrusting sword moveset, which is very quick, going to be doing piercing damage. Now, the only downside, if you can say it's a downside, is that it does get the Great Spear heavy attacks, which is going to be a bit slower than the heavy thrusting sword ones, especially with that running heavy attack that it does get. But this also extends to the guard counter. And the funny thing is, the Great Spear guard counter is actually faster than the heavy thrusting sword guard counter. And both of them do the exact same stance damage as well. So there is literally no downside to the Sword Lance guard counter. It's faster than all the other heavy thrusting swords, going to potentially out damage great axes, going to be really fast, and do like great sword stance damage too. And arguably the best part about it is that it's good one-handed and two-handed. You can pair it alongside a shield and get a really quick guard counter, and also benefit of things like shield poking attacks and have some really good synergy there. Or you can just go ahead and two-hand it, because this thing actually does get the best blocking potential out of all the other heavy thrusting swords. So yeah, this is a weapon that you can build around so many different ways. It's amazing with status effects. It's amazing just going pure strength, but you can just like slap on the deflect tier, go ahead and just block a bunch of different stuff and just get some guard counters off, and you're just going to be doing monstrous amounts of damage. The colossal weapons are obviously going to be really good guard countering options, as they can not only just result in the highest amount of damage, and they're actually on the quicker end as well. Like these guard counters can be quicker than things like curved greatswords, which is honestly insane for how much damage and stance damage they can do. Now they are going to have a bit slower recovery animations, so you still might end up getting hit afterwards, but you're still going to win that trade anyway. And for things like the Giant Crusher, it can just make for this really stupid amounts of guard counter builds, as this one is just the best blocking weapon in the entire game. Like this thing can just block better than most shields in the game, it's that good. And it can just output just stupid amounts of damage with a guard counter, and do 45 stance damage too. Now I'm not going to go with this one being the best for colossal weapons, because there actually are that do get some more stance damage. The Troll's Hammer, the Anvil Hammer, Gazing Finger, and the Bloodfiend's Arm all get 50 stance damage with their guard counter attacks. And obviously the Bloodfiend's Arm is the only one there that can be infused, so that's going to be my pick for the best colossal weapon for guard countering, and the second best guard countering weapon in the game. You're gonna slap Cragblade onto this thing, put it alongside a Bleed Infusion, and whenever you don't have an opening for a charged heavy attack, just go ahead and deflect and get yourself a guard counter, and do over 60 stance damage with that Cragblade and that deflect tier active. Yeah, this weapon is just one of the best in the entire game for a lot of different reasons, and its guard counter potential is just one of them. The best deflecting and guard countering weapons in the entire game are going to go to the thrusting shields. These things are just stupid. Now the Carian thrusting shield, I think being the better one of the two, as it does just get better blocking with its high guard boost and high physical guarded damage negation, because obviously blocking is very important when going with these builds. So this one is going to be the obvious option. Now there are so many reasons that makes the thrusting shields the best guard counter options. And that is one, they are just incredibly quick. They can be just as fast as things like greatswords, do just as much stance damage too, and they could potentially even do more damage because it's doing piercing damage in this attack. And with piercing damage, a lot of enemies are weaker to it, and when enemies are in the middle of an attack combo, they're going to take bonus damage. And with guard countering builds, you're probably just going to be attacking mid-combo anyway, so almost every single guard counter that you try and get off is more likely than not going to result in a counter attack. And then this paired alongside the Spear Talisman and having the Deflect tier and the Curved Sword Talisman alongside the Two-Handed Sword Talisman, these things are going to destroy a lot of different enemies and bosses. Now the obvious downside of guard countering in the middle of an attack combo is that you do have the potential of being staggered out of it or just being hit directly afterwards. But that basically doesn't happen with the thrusting shields, which is what makes them the best in the entire game. And that's because they get blocking frames in the middle of the attack animation, and then in the recovery frames as well. And if you're worried about getting staggered out of it at the beginning of the animation, you don't have to worry because it actually gets hyper armor too. But the fact that you do get these blocking frames in the recovery animation is just stupid. You can just like freely spam it at any given point, just constantly just end up trading out with these guard counters, and directly after guard countering, you're just gonna block the next attack. And as long as you're just timing your deflects, you're just not losing any types of stamina. And the guard counters just hardly lose any stamina as well. So this build is very easy to spam and has very high cheese potential. It can trivialize so many different encounters. Now I think the major downside of the thrusting shield guard counter is going to be its range. It obviously does not lunge very far, but if you're close enough to be able to block an attack, more likely than not, you're going to be close enough to do damage as well. And also, I forgot to mention the most obvious thing. You're blocking with a shield. Like, it's a shield. It's going to be better than all the other weapons in the game. You're going to get really high guard boost, really high guarded damage negation. So even if you miss a deflect, it's not going to be that big of a deal. So yes, it might not make for the most fun type of guard counter build, but I do consider it to be the most powerful one. Anyway, that is the video now done. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. As for the next video, I'm probably going to cover over some more builds, or just go over like another top 10 weapons list, whether it be things like top 10 strength weapons or top 10 faith weapons. If you want to see something like that, just let me know down in the comments, and definitely do subscribe for that as well. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.